Okay. Okay, so I'll do my intro again for people who missed it because now it's being recorded. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for everyone who's teaching. We'll go in chronological order tonight. I'll go first, then Joe, then Jay, then Amalia, and then Alana will wrap things up. So to begin, share my screen here. I want to begin by talking about the Seder plate. And let me mute people. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I'm sure everyone whoever is presenting will get to them after they're done presenting. But this way we can limit the background noise. If there's a pressing question that you really want to ask out loud, hopefully it's not too pressing, but save it for the end, and I'll unmute people at the end. So if you want to ask your question out loud, you can do so at the end. Okay. So we're all familiar with the Seder plate, I think. And generally, most of us, probably all of us, our Seder plates look something, unless they're sort of a very contemporary design that we have. Generally, our Seder plates look something like the Seder plate on the right, the one that's titled the Arizal. Has chazeret, charoset, karpas, maror, beitza, the egg, and zroa, the roasted bone. But the widespread use of that Seder plate, the one we actually use, is relatively late, certainly in the Ashkenazic world, and not the only one. So let's take a look at some of the alternative Seder plates that were out there traditionally and traditionally used, especially by Ashkenazic communities. And then we'll talk a little bit about the history of the Seder plate and where this whole idea of a Seder plate comes from. Because of course, the Torah never mentions a Seder plate. The way they celebrated Pesach in the Torah was quite different than the way we do so today. So if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Moshe Isserles, better known as the Ramah, who writes the gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, describing the practices of Ashkenazim, his Seder plate looks like the one on the left. So he has a couple of items that we don't have on our Seder. One item that we don't have on our Seder plate, right? He has salt water on his Seder plate, and he also doesn't have chazeret. He doesn't have lettuce on his Seder plate. And the structure of his Seder plate is also a bit different in terms of how it's laid out. So the reason why the Ramah lays out his Seder plate in this way is because the Ramah felt that there's a principle that you should never pass over a mitzvah, that you should, on the way to do another mitzvah. And he wanted his Seder plate to reflect this principle. So if you're sitting with the Seder plate facing you, so you're sort of sitting where my arrow key is, the first items on the Seder plate that your hand is going to reach are those items that you use first at the meal. And then you sort of make your way out across the plate. And in that way, you never pass over the possibility of doing a mitzvah. So that's the Ramah's Seder plate. If we scroll down, we'll go back to the Sphira a little bit later. But if we go down and look now at the Vilna Gaon Seder plate, so the Ramah lived in the 16th century, the Vilna Gaon lived in the late 18th, early 19th century. His Seder plate also looks different from ours. So the Vilna Gaon was the great opponent of Hasidim, and his Seder plate has far fewer items. Again, it doesn't have chazeret, no lettuce, and it also doesn't have karpas. So the Vilna Gaon put his Seder plate out on the table later than we do, which is why he didn't have karpas. He'd already had his karpas, but he'd done it before. And then for the Vilna Gaon, the Seder plate was really symbolizing and about the meal. So it made sense that the karpas, which is the appetizer you eat first, and then you bring the Seder plate to the table. Now, he wasn't concerned about this principle that you shouldn't pass over a mitzvah because, and of course, if you look at the Seder plate many of us use on the right, we also don't seem to be concerned about this because the first things that we encounter if we're sitting at this end of the Seder plate are not necessarily the items that we're going to use first in the meal. There's a principle that, there's an idea that that principle only applies when both mitzvahs can be done at the same time. but the Vilna Gaon and presumably the Ari also would have said that each item on the Seder plate is a mitzvah that has its own unique moment. So you don't have to be worried about that you're going to sort of cut across one to take something else. That each mitzvah, each item has its unique time at the Seder. So where does this whole idea of a Seder plate come from? Because it's not in the Torah at all. So in the Mishnah, in Psachim, it says that the person leading the Seder should have at least 2 cooked items that are brought before him. And the Gemara explains that there need to be 2 cooked items. One is Zecher LePesach, one is a remembrance of the Korban Pesach, and the other is Zecher LeHaggadah. Because the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, was not the only sacrifice that was brought. There was also a festival sacrifice that was brought as well. So that's why what those 2 items symbolized. Despite the fact that Gemara says that, there have always been authorities who also added, and people who added other meaning onto these items. So there's a source from the Gaonim, the authorities that lived in what's modern day Iraq in the 9th and 10th century, that these 2 cooked items actually represent Moshe and Aaron. And in fact, in this tshuva, we won't look at it inside because of time, he actually says that some people put a 3rd piece of meat on their Seder plate, or a 3rd cooked item, to symbolize Miriam. So you have, that's what this source suggests the food items are really about. Over time, however, though, there becomes this custom of having an egg along with the shank bone. The zroa, the shank bone, clearly is connected to the Korban Pesach. It's a little bit less clear why an egg is connected to the Haggadah, the other Korban, the other sacrifice that was brought. But that already, by the Middle Ages, certainly in Ashkenazi countries, is becoming the custom. So we explained before, at the outset, why the Ramah's Seder plate looks the way it does, and why the Vilna Gaon Seder plate looks the way it does. But what about our Seder plates? Why do we have this sort of unusual arrangement? Let's take a look at we'll read through this contemporary source, and then we'll see how it applies. So Rav Melamed, who's a posek in Israel today and has a wonderful series on halacha, writes that the 3 matzot are on top. They're really sort of on the bottom, but he means you put them down first, corresponding to the sfirot of Chochmah, Bina, and Dat. And under the matzot on the right side is Roa, corresponding to the sphere of Hesed, and the egg on the left corresponding to Gvura. And underneath them in the middle is the Maror, which corresponds to Tiferet. Below the Maror on the right is the Haroset, corresponding to Netzach. And the left is Karpas, corresponding to Hod. Underneath them in the center is the Maror used for the Korach sandwich, and that corresponds to Yesod. And the plate itself corresponds to Malchut. So what Rav Melamed is describing here is he's saying that according to the practice that has really become dominant, this is based on Kabbalistic principles, on a mystical understanding of the world. And in Lurianic Kabbalah, which spread really like wildfire across the Jewish world, beginning in the 16th century, and really influenced the Ashkenazic world with the rise of Hasidim in the 18th and 19th century, there's an idea that God interacts with the world in a very specific way, through certain attributes, through certain sfirot. And that the more we sort of can allude to these sfirot in our practices, the more we can strengthen the connection between ourselves and God, and the more we can sort of bring God's presence into the world. So the Seder plate that the Ari designed was made in a way that it would look like the chart of the Sfirot. So that if God is up here, sort of, if God's presence in his most refined or pure or visible is up here in Keter, then God sort of gives life force and vitality to the world, making their way down slowly through the Sfirot, moving from more spiritual levels to more physical ones, all the way down to the end, which is to Malchut. So our Seder plate looks like that, looks like this chart of the Sfirot. in which the matzot are chokhmah, bina, and dat, the highest sfirot. They're actually placed on the bottom underneath. And then you place, then according to this custom, you place the Seder plate on top. Then you have Zroa as Chesed, Beitza, the egg, as Gvura, Maror as Tiferet, and that moves down also through this chain into Haroset being Netzach, Karpas being Chod, and Yesod being Chazeret. And of course, it all ends with you're sitting right here at the end of the Seder plate, accepting this, this divine life force flowing down. So for the Hasidim and for the Kabbalists, the Seder isn't just about retelling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, retelling the story of the Exodus, or sort of symbolism that might easily come to mind that we can think about, and like spilling out the wine and what that alludes to. But there's also this hidden symbolism that is really about connecting and connecting God with the world and trying to bring down divine energy into the world. And from this perspective, it's everything we do has a real impact on the cosmos. The littlest thing either strengthens or takes away our connection with God. And even though most of us probably don't think about this as we go about our daily lives, at the Seder, if we use a Seder plate like this, as many of us do, it actually alludes back to those teachings. So that's something very, a little bit maybe esoteric, but to end with one more practical historical note, and then I think I'm almost out of time, and that is the Ari who lived in the land of Israel has chazeret on his Seder plate, has lettuce. None of the Ashkenazim, we saw the Ramah and the Vilna Gaon have chazeret on their Seder plates, because lettuce was something that was very hard to get in Eastern Europe, right? There weren't a lot of leafy green vegetables that were available around Pesach time. So that's also why the way in which communities celebrated Pesach and the foods they used was always limited and defined by what was literally available at the time that in the spring in the areas in which they lived. So I'm going to hand things over to you, Joe, now. Let me unmute you.
Do you want to stop share?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. So we are taught further on in the Gemara from what Rabbi Noah quoted in Pesachim on page 116, Amud Aleph. When it comes to answering the question of our children at the Seder, we matchil beganut u'mesayem b'shevach. So we should start with the story of our exodus from Egypt with a disparaging remark and finish our story of redemption with words of affirmation. In the Sefer Netivot Shalom, or as I assume the author, Rabbi Shalom Noach Berezovsky, and he passed away in the year 2000, I'm sure he would prefer the Sefer to be called the Netivos Shalom. But he asked the question, and that question really intrigued me. Why do we start the story by putting ourselves down? Why start with Gunut? Why not just jump into the story at the beginning with us being chosen by God to be redeemed from Egypt with a compliment? So I'm always intrigued by the what ifs. What if we start the story in a nice way with our praises and our good qualities? Why do we have to start with an insult? So the Shlomo Rebbe explains that it's precisely because we were so awful as a people that God chose to redeem us. Because we worshipped idols and we were so enslaved to the Egyptian system of gods, or the systems of gods, that God chose us to be his people, and that choice of us will last forever. We simply could not be any worse than we were at the time, and yet God still chose us to be God's people. However bad we were after that point, we could never ever get to be as terrible as we were when God selected us to be his. There is therefore nothing that we could do to make God reject us. It is an unbreakable relationship, no matter what, forever. So we return to that daf in the Talmud. We see that Rav and Shmuel disagree about the details. What can they possibly be arguing about? Rav says that we should start the story with Avadim Ha'inu, Avdei Zorah, whereas Shmuel says we should start with Avadim Ha'inu. For Rav, the greatest sin a Jew can commit is worshipping other gods. Since our greatest characteristic is our faith in God, so the biggest insult is when we lack that faith. But for Shmuel, the greatest insult is to say that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Our servitude in Egypt took us to the 49th level of impurity. We were immersed in Mitzrayim. We were idol worshippers. That is insulting. But how can we be blamed for being slaves? Mitzrayim, Egypt, is to blame for the forced labor and the daily hardships that were forced upon the people. But they can't be blamed for Bnei Israel's self-identification as slaves in Egypt. They had back-breaking work to do, and this is nothing to be ashamed of. But the fact that they came to see themselves as slaves and not as God's people, enslaved, is truly an insult to them. It is this self-identification that causes them so much trouble once they leave. It is why they can't cope when their leader leaves and they build a golden calf, and why they refuse to move out of God's direct protection and into the land of Canaan, and are then forced to wander for a further 40 years. In the Seder, we read the verse, "In the blood you shall live, in the blood you shall live." Why is this phrase repeated twice? It hints at two actions that Bnei Israel had to perform to demonstrate a willingness to change before they could be redeemed from Egypt. These are the blood of the Brit Milah and the blood of the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach was a sign of their fidelity to God. It was a direct rejection of gods of Egypt and faith that God would protect them from the wrath of the Egyptians, incensed by the abuse of their sheep god. Brit Milah showed that the male Israelites' willingness to self-sacrifice in order to identify as part of Bnei Israel. It showed they were willing to carry that identity with them forever. We acknowledge both the opinions of Rav and Shmuel at our Seder night. We include Avadim Ha'inu straight after Manishtana, and Avdei Avodah Zarah right after the four sons. We recognize that both these issues are fundamental to us as Jews. In fact, one is dependent on the other. The more disconnected we are from God, the more likely we are to become susceptible to the pulls of the world around us. Our connections to God give us as Jews the confidence and self-esteem to walk our own path and weather the challenges and events this world presents us with, without fundamentally changing who we are or what we stand for. It isn't just belief in God, but the belief in myself as a human being, created in the image of God, that gives me the strength to be a slave without being enslaved, or to face any challenges without being defeated.
Thank you, Shka. So JL, let me allow screen sharing and
so I'm unmuted, right?
yes.
I'm on here. First of all, I want to thank you for asking me to be part of this. I'm honored and pleasured, and I'm pleased to be part of this community. And I look forward to attending Shul now that shortly I will be fully vaccinated, and I'll be looking forward to actually be inside a synagogue again after almost a year. So I look at the Haggadah not from a philosophical way. I've been honored to have studied it with some great teachers in Israel, Hebrew University, but as an educator and as a father. So I just want to share with you a couple of my favorite passages. I see it as a reenactment. And quite often, you know, we view it as a reenactment for our children. But I also think that the reenactment has great relevance to us as adults as well. And so I kind of want to share two passages from the Haggadah that I've been very, very impressed with by a phenomenal artist by the name of David Moss. David Moss was commissioned to do a Haggadah in 1983, and it was so well received that he did a facsimile editions of that, and they actually exist in museums all around the world. The last of the facsimile editions was sold, I think, for around $50,000. And then they published the editions of his Haggadah recently, or not so recently, in book form as well. And in my previous school in Philadelphia, we used to give our 6th grade class a copy of the Moss Haggadah. Everybody got one. And we would use it to study from. And we used the illuminations. So he was influenced by the medieval illuminated Haggadot, and he himself then decided he was going to create his own. So my inspiration for most of when I read the Haggadah, and I have a ton of different ones, is actually looking at the illuminations. How does the author, how does an artist depict an experience visually? Okay, we do that so well during the Seder musically. We have all these tunes for almost everything, whether Sephardic or Ashkenazic or Edom Mizrach. But I'm really interested as a father and as an educator by how we can depict these in a visual way. So I'm going to share with you a couple, two images from the Moss Haggadah, just two of many that I'm exceptionally impressed and have influenced me, again, as an educator. By the way, I just want to say something, Rabbi. I was an adopted son of Yemenites in Israel. The Yemenites don't have a Seder plate. They don't. Their entire table is the Seder plate. So around the perimeter of the table is the romaine lettuce, and literally the whole perimeter of the table, and then the whole table is the Seder plate. So the Yemenites are very, very interesting tradition with that. So I'm going to share this print. And this is I don't even like saying the 4 sons because it's gender specific, but it is the 4 sons, but let's say the 4 children. And I want to tell you a little bit how this inspired me. I was lucky enough when I used to teach at Camp Ramah, Wisconsin. One summer, David Moss spent the summer there as the artist in residence, and I got to know him very well. And I got to hear his explanations about how he depicted the text of the Haggadah in a visual way. So again, this is, you know, B'Shem Omram, David Moss, but I'm gonna add some of my own stuff. So he decided to, I'll ask him, an educator, does anyone see, how is he depicting these 4 children? What do you recognize here? I guess, can they unmute, Rabbi, or that you have to unmute them?
I'm going to let people unmute themselves. So you can feel free to unmute yourselves and post some answers.
They're all blessed. All of them say Baruch HaMakom, Baruch, so each one of them sounds, you bless them, or the one that's leading the Seder is blessing each of the sons, regardless of what he is.
Jay, you're muted now, though.
His iconography here is a depiction of the sons on playing cards. Why playing cards? He said, because anyone who's had multiple children know that you never know what comes out of the deck the next one, that each child is different, that no 2 brothers are alike, no 2 sisters, no 2 siblings are alike. And so, and he learned this from himself as a father. And I just thought that I have 4 children, you know, thank God, but they're all different. So I like the way that it was depicted that, you know, we don't know what's going to be next. The other thing, and you said they're all blessed. So it's very hard to see this, but this micro calligraphy here is a blessing. And according to Moss, that no matter what the child is, no matter how he or she turns out, nevertheless, there are children and they should be blessed regardless. And the other thing that I take from this, now this is my reading into it, is this is not really depiction of children, of people aren't born wise. People aren't born evil. People aren't born Tom or Sheino Yedei Lishol. You know, as an educator, we could become evil. We could become Chacham or Tom or Sheino Yedei Lishol. It depends on the adults in our life. It depends on our parents. It depends on our schools, how they shape us. And I see this to some degree as a challenge to the adults. Okay, what have we done to create the circumstances to have a child that might be seen as Rasha? What have we done enough to help the Sheino Yodei Lish'ol learn enough so he or she can ask the relevant questions? And I can go on and on with that as well. So I see this as a challenge to parents. Okay, again, we're born with a blank slate, and it's really up to us and our schools. I'm a head of school to help fashion, to help mold kids into character, whether they have integrity, whether they're interested or they're alienated from our tradition. The other thing is that, and this, you know, in a culture that we're living with right now with cancel culture, what we're forgetting, what so much of our culture is forgetting is that people are complicated. There's no black and white. Look at at our forefathers and foremothers, or the greatest of our prophets, Moses. They all sinned. They all had different sides to them. And I view, if you took all these four children together, I feel you'd have probably a real individual. Sometimes that individual is Chacham. Sometimes that individual, I don't even like use the word Rasha, but is alienated, says, you know, it does not identify with what you want him or her to identify with. Other times they're naive, or they're Tamim, and other times they're so bewildered they don't even know what to ask. And so our challenge as parents and as educators is to take the children in our lives, whether we're teachers or parents, and knowing that every human being has all four of these qualities, these characteristics, and see how we can develop the Chacham in them, knowing that regardless of how much the Chacham might come out, nevertheless, there's going to be an element of the Rasha, the Tam, the Sheino Yodei Lishol, because that's the way, that's human life, that's existence. So I wanted to share that from my perspective again as an educator, and I want to share. Can I share another one? Do I have permission?
Definitely, go for it.
This is also from the Haggadah, and this I'm going to again say about the adults, for adults. And you can't capture this as well. So this is B'chol Dor V'Dor Chayam Adam Nerot Et Atzmo Ki'iluhu Yatza Mitzrayim. Now what you can't see here for sure is these are the generations in history of the Jewish people. By each figure, there is the paper, what's used here, it's a mirror. So when you look into it, you can see yourself as if you were in the generation, let's say, of the Israelites, or the generation of whoever they might be, the Tanaim, or this generation, or that generation. And I just love the fact, again, from a pedagogical perspective, how hard is it, or easy is it really, to imagine ourselves as if we came out of Egypt? Okay, we're living in 2021. This Sunday, I'm doing a session with the school with a young man from Darfur who escaped the ravages of war in war-torn Sudan and escaped into Israel. And his story is as if he did come out of Egypt. But how do we identify with that? So as part of his pedagogy here, and this is again the way he illuminates this, as you're reading this Haggadah, this page, okay, you see the reflection of yourself. So this clearly is medieval times when Jews were required to wear this hat, or this might have been times of Maimonides, or whatever it might be. But this is for men, for women. This is how we can reinsert ourselves. Look in the mirror and say, you know what? Maybe somehow we can reimagine ourselves during these times when we were persecuted and we weren't that free. However, now for the adults, how do I interpret this differently than David Moss? We live in a world where there's refugees. We live in a world where there are people who are still in slavery. We live in a world where even in this town of Cleveland, you've got sexual slavery, you've got all sorts of stuff. I mean, not just in the developing countries, but even in the West. And I think that as adults, we need to look into this mirror. And if we want to really, B'chol Dor V'Dor, see ourselves as if we left Egypt. We have to identify with those people that want to leave Egypt today, or those people that have already left Egypt, and how do we help them resettle? How do we help them find a home? How do we help them live a full and meaningful life? And so for me, this verse, B'chol Dor Vador, it's not just that I should think about Egypt, but when I relate to Egypt, how do I bring that into my modern, everyday existential experience so I can relate to others who've had their own Egypts? You know, Cleveland's got a bunch of, you know, we have a lot of immigrants here, a lot of refugees. Israel has refugees from war-torn Africa. How do we relate to them? Are we forgetting this lesson, okay, that we need to see them similar to the way we saw ourselves when we were persecuted? So for me, as an adult, when I look into these mirrors and I see these different eras or periods of time, for me, it speaks to me personally that I can never forget that we were once slaves in Egypt. And how do I act on that? I have to do whatever I can, maybe to alleviate the suffering of one family, of one person. And it's funny because the Rambam changes the word here. He doesn't say lirot et atzmo. The Rambam goes b'chol dor vador chayam adam leharot et atzmo ki ilu hu yatzam mitzrayim, to show as if one. Okay, and for me, showing is action. It's not enough just to identify, but it's also mean you got to also have action, and you got to you have to do something. So I think I'm out of time. Am I out of time? I have one other thing I'd like to share, but if I'm out of time, I'll stop.
Go for it. Well, I don't think anyone will mind.
All right, so I had the pleasure, the honor of studying for 3 years with Rabbi David Hartman, Zichrono Livracha, at Hebrew University. And this was a Haggadah that he and a colleague of mine, Noam Tzion, put out called A Different Night. And I've always had problems towards the end of the Haggadah with Shvach Hamatcha, pour out your wrath upon the Gentiles. So Hartman actually, he didn't take it out of his Haggadah, but he also changed it. Shvach avatcha ala goyim asher ducha. Pour out your love on the nations who have known you and the kingdoms who call upon your name. So again, as an educator, I don't want children, I don't want my kids growing up thinking that the world is made up of Jews and anti-Semites. It would be horrific if they felt that way. So I think what David Hartman adds here in his Haggadah is very important. There are people out there who aren't Jewish, the other nations, the Goyim, who have been kind to us, who have helped us, who have not turned a blind eye to us, even during the Holocaust and other times that we were persecuted. And I think this is also a critically important message, other than kids can grow up in thinking that it's us always against them. And you should know also that, and I'll stop sharing, I'm going to end in a moment. I have here a Haggadah of the B'nai Israel of India. By the way, if you've ever seen Haggadah in Marathi script, okay? So the Jews of India, because they never ever experienced anti-Semitism, they took out Shvach Hamatcha. They never related to it. They didn't have to. They never had anyone persecuting them in India. So that was removed from their Haggadah. That the Jews of Cochin, I should say. And remember, they fled the Inquisition and they settled in Cochin. And from the time until most of them left for Israel, they never experienced anti-Semitism ever. So it's just interesting that community took it out because it just wasn't part of their reality or their existence. That's it for now. I don't know if anyone has any questions. So.
Sure, and it's interesting how I spoke about how our food choices at the Seder are based on our surroundings, but also some of what we can relate to in the Haggadah is also very much based on our lived experiences and the experiences of our communities. Amalia, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and hand things over to you.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be here this evening. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate and teach. I have been spending the year training as a resident in chaplaincy at the Cleveland Clinic. And as I was preparing for tonight, one of my patients came to mind. I didn't know at first when I went into his room that he was a Vietnam veteran, but he was really not a happy camper. He didn't want to be in the hospital, which most patients don't. And, you know, he didn't know what the timeline was. It just really kind of sunk into himself in his bed. And I started to ask him about himself, and somehow it came up that he had served in Vietnam. And I said, "Thank you for your service." And he said, "You're welcome. Not everybody says that." And I acknowledged that, you know, I know the history, that it was very difficult for many soldiers who were coming back from Vietnam in terms of how they were received. And then I asked him sort of, you know, derech agav, also, you know, could you just tell me what you did professionally? And he said, "Well, I worked for the telephone company for 25 years. And, you know, I connected different pieces of equipment, and sometimes I was up on those poles. And of course, for those of you who know me, you know my son Vrami, and I said, oh, I have someone who would just follow you around, you know, just if you want to jump right in that bucket with you and go up there and go down and help with that project." And then I looked at him and I said, "You know, the world only functioned because of you and the phone company doing what you were doing back in the day. I mean, if there was a fire and the phone lines didn't work, the fire trucks didn't come, the police didn't come, you know, people didn't know what was happening with their family. That before the internet, that was communications." And he looked at me, and it's hard to really capture this, but he went from being like sunken in his bed to like he straightened. Like he straightened up in the bed. He's still, you know, lying down and still very weak, but he became like an animated man, and he started telling me about all these different projects, and then he started talking about how meaningful it was for him to be involved in the work because he knew it was contributing to society and how many things depended on it. And it was very striking for me because, you know, when I left the room, I wasn't sure if the patient was suffering from dementia. I still didn't know fully what the diagnosis was. But what I did see was that there was a total transformation of him that had happened from recognizing and honoring the avodah, the calling that he had devoted his life to. And seeing that in him. And it brought to mind for me something related to the Haggadah. In Sefer Shemot, when it says, Moshe turned and went down from the mount with the 2 tablets in his hand, and that they were written on both sides. On one side and the other, they were written, and the tablets were the work of Hashem, and the writing of Hashem was cut through on the tablets. So on this word cut through, the rabbis say, don't read cut through, charut, but rather cherut, freedom. The tablets that were cut through were freedom itself. And so part of what struck me about this is, first of all, my kids, since we're, you know, obviously talking about Pesach and things that children love, if you tell your kids that, you know, there were these letters that were sort of levitating inside the tablets of stone, like that's just a completely cool image. It's amazing. But it's also about what the work of the Seder is, which is to say that by really taking these words into our hearts and letting them really go through us. That what happens in that process is a process of becoming free, right? In a sense, watching my patient, I was sort of seeing that happen. What was making him free was seeing his sense of purpose. And there's another thing in the Seder which we see over and over again on a linguistic level that ties into this. You know, we say avadim hayinu, we were slaves in Egypt. And that's the root of that is eved, okay, which is it's slavery, but it's also something else, and that something else is avodah, and avodah is service. So from the very same Hebrew word, we have both things. There's cut through and there's freedom. And then with cherut and with the root eved, we have slavery, and we also have avodah, as in avodat Hashem, service of God. So I don't want to take too much time because I know we're all sharing the time among us, but I guess I want to say that for me, a lot of this work of preparing for Pesach is about not rejecting the parts of myself where I feel that I am stuck like a slave, but in a sense diving into those places, because that same root eved is also the way to avodat Hashem. Our holy language is telling us that it isn't by running away from or pushing away those parts of ourselves that we will be able to approach freedom and come into our calling of service of God, but rather it's through actually engaging and struggling with that. And I think that the fact that so much of the activity we do in preparing for Pesach reminds us of aspects of the slavery of Egypt is no surprise. I mean, they were making bricks and cleaning up after that, and we are doing the cleaning and the preparation. There, obviously, I'm not saying that we're slaves, but there's a certain remez to that, and the more that we sort of embrace that as a derech towards the insight that this Chag can bring to us, I think that we're given a beautiful key to deepen our experience at the Seder. Chag Sameach.
Shakala, Hag Sameach. Alana, I'm going to unmute you and hand things over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna actually share my screen. Am I able to do that?
Yes, you should be.
Yeah. Okay. So before I share, I just want to thank you, Rabbi Levitt, for giving us this opportunity and for bringing us together to speak, bringing us together in virtual space, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I always like it. For me, it's a way to, I can't stand the cleaning, but I like sort of trying to prepare and get into the mental space. So thanks for the opportunity to do that, for myself to kind of ramp up towards Pesach. So I'll tell you as I share my screen here, let's see, where my remarks are coming from. There's sort of two questions or things that I had in my head while I was preparing this. One is, I'm always perplexed by halal right before we're about to eat. We're like we read and we do, and we have the parsley and the salt water, and we're waiting and we're going around the table, and then we're getting ready to eat, and all of a sudden there's halal. And, you know, I've always been perplexed by that. Like, why do we read that first section of halal now before we eat? So a little bit of my remarks is kind of dealing with that question. But mostly my remarks are about storytelling And I myself love to read stories. I love to write stories and listen to them and tell them and retell them. And I think the Seder really gives us an opportunity. It's such a wonderful part of our tradition that we have this chance that in today, in the 21st century, we don't sit around and tell stories much in this kind of formalized way. So this is really about my talk is really about storytelling. That said, if we imagine the Haggadah as a story, the narrative is pretty muddled. And this is something I find myself every year on Pesach, like I can't follow it. It's not like the Megillat Esther, where we have a narrative arc and we follow our characters and we go through. There's a lot of back and forth in the story. And I used to think, well, if I could just sort of use the table of contents, use our Seder, the first page of our Haggadah, to help me in my mind think about how the narrative flow works. This picture here is the table of contents from Jordan Gorfinkel's Passover Haggadah graphic novel. I'm a huge fan. It came out like 2 years ago. I just love it so much. And this is a picture from his first page. And he has here like what looks like a table of contents, Kadesh Rachatz, Karpatz Yachatz. But these chapter titles, if you want to call them that, actually just mark the various activities that we do as we move through the Seder. They really don't signify a section in the story. So this isn't like a classical table of contents. It's more kind of order for us in terms of our actions. So if we follow through the Haggadah and try to make headings of our own, it doesn't really map on well to this, because the structure of the Haggadah, and I just flipped through a few times as I was preparing for the talk to see like if I was to break it down into sections, what does it look like? So we have the 4 questions, then we have the synoptic answer, we were slaves in Egypt, then we go to the sages at Bnei Brak, the 4 sons, the quick synopsis of Jewish history from Abraham to Bnei Israel coming out of Egypt with great wealth. Then we double back again to talk about the travails of slavery to the great Exodus. Then we go to the 10 plagues and then to Dayenu. I cannot promise in my 7 or so remaining minutes to make sense of this, these many different pieces of the story, to kind of tie them up into a nice narrative arc. But what I do want to do is try to distill what 2 of the narrative arcs are in the story. And here I'm actually, first I should just point out what I mean by narrative arc. Any good story begins with characters who are in need, they are lacking, they are troubled, or they're blind. And as the story progresses, the characters grow, they mature, they gain what they need to find happiness, fulfillment, or to find themselves redeemed. And this is true, this is a sort of universal truth, this kind of structural root of great stories, fairy tales, myths. We see it, for example, in the story of Cinderella, where she moves from being a cinder girl to finding happiness with the man of her dreams. We see it in the great novel like Les Miserables, where the ex-convict Jean Valjean struggles until he experiences redemption. We see it in our musicals like Hamilton, where our hero begins his life impoverished and in hardship, and then he pulls himself up and rises to success. And though he does die in the end, he leaves a legacy of influence. So this is a kind of root universal structure that stories move along. And our Haggadah also, our Seder also moves along a narrative arc. But in this case, there's really 2 narrative arcs. And here I'm gonna return, I was like astounded that Joe dealt with this same exact pasuk that I'm going to deal with, and that we're bookmarked. So she's in the beginning and I'm at the end. And I think it's sort of, it worked out really appropriately. where the narrative arc of our story of the Seder is Matchil b'gnut u'misayem b'shevach, as Joe pointed out. We begin with disgrace and we conclude with glory. But the question is, this is the real question of the Seder, and the question that the rabbis of the Talmud were trying to get at was, what is that disgrace? What does it look like? And what is that glory? What does it look like? So if we're to draw those narratives, what is the shape of them? And of course, the rabbis disagreed on what the shape of those narratives were. Shmuel says, well, disgrace refers to slavery. Rav says, no, it's not about physical. Disgrace isn't about the physical situation that Bnei Israel were in. Disgrace refers to their spiritual situation, their idol worshiping. And so Shmuel's story is that Bnei Israel, and we, as we reenact the story of Bnei Israel, move from physical enslavement to political liberation. Rav's story is that we move from a degradation of the soul to spiritual freedom. Of course, both of these are true. We don't need resolution. Both of these stories are true, and that is what makes our Magid, our Seder, so good, because we're able to weave both of these themes together. The movement from physical enslavement and the movement from spiritual degradation. And we get a hint of both of these narratives from the very beginning of the Seder, when we issue an invitation to all of those who we are with. And the invitation in this opening line, this calling out in the opening lines of the Seder, Ha lach ma'anya. This is the blood of our affliction. Ti'achalu avatana be'ara de Mitzrayim. This is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. And here comes the invitation. Anyone who is hungry should come and eat. Anyone who is in need should partake. And a way to read this is, anyone who is hungry for physical nourishment, for the physical, should come and eat. Anyone who is in need for spiritual sustenance should come take part in our storytelling, in our conversation. And again, repeating Joe's point in a slightly different framework here, we have two beginnings to the story. Our story starts in two different places. And one start is Avadim Hayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim. This is the physical part of the story. We were enslaved, physically enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. And the second beginning then is Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu. This is another, we have Avadim appear again, that same verb that we've been talking about the same Shoresh, Eved, work, slavery, return again here, either as slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, or as Ovdei Avodah Zarah, that we're worshiping or enslaved to or working towards idolatry, towards idols. And so these two stories here are stories of physical enslavement and story of spiritual enslavement. The first one's pretty easy for us to understand, and I think very easy for us to appreciate as Jews in 21st century America, the conditions that we're living in. And the second one, I would say, is a little bit more difficult to understand. What does it mean to be spiritually enslaved? That's a real philosophical or existential question, which I'm not going to get into, but worthwhile for us each to think inside of ourselves. What does it mean to be spiritually enslaved, and how do we come out of that slavery? And I'm going to sort of wrap up by saying that I think that our storytelling does end up for us, you know, as we're about to break for our meal, as we go through the whole Seder evening with our songs and our hors d'oeuvres and our telling tales to one another, our stories to one another, I think we do end up at a stop point or kind of a high point to our narrative arc. And the first one is the answer to physical enslavement, which is our meal is served. And there we are with the delights, the delicacies of our meal, and that we're able to appreciate that meal, our freedom, so much more because of the story that we've taken ourselves through. And the other is with our spiritual freedom. And the culmination here of our spiritual freedom, and here I'm getting to the issue of Hallel, that right before the meal, we recite Hallel. And the parts of Hallel that we recite from Tehillim 113 and 114 are actually parts that are very much connected to the story of Mitzrayim. Unlike the other parts of Hallel, these have direct connection to the story of the Haggadah that we recite on Pesach, on Erev Pesach. So here you can see in Tehillim 113, Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Avdei Hashem. Hallelujah, O servants of the Lord, Ovdei Hashem, those who work for not Pharaoh anymore, but work for Hashem. Give praise in the name of Hashem, because we've reached this spiritual high. And the spiritual high comes as we recite the Tehillim 114, B'tzeit Yisrael Mitzrayim, Hayam Ra'av Yanos, Hayarden Yisov La'achor. This is the story here. We've gone through the whole story. We've reached the Red Sea. And now with Hallel, we can experience, by reciting Hallel, we can experience that spiritual liberation through reenacting, through singing our crossing of the Red Sea. And I'll end by just a few two interesting ways of thinking when we are reading Hallel, when we are singing that part about crossing the Red Sea. What tone might we take? How might we think about about our song? And so one, I bring up a small section from the Talmud that talks about the Jewish people at the time of the Beit HaMikdash, when they received a little bit of the Pesach offering, just the size of an olive, because there were so many families, so many people in Jerusalem who wanted to get just a piece of the Pesach offering. They just got just the size of an olive. Kezeta pischa, v'halela paka igara. Even though they didn't have huge feasts, just a little bit of meat the size of an olive, Halela Paka Igara, which is the Hallel that was said during this consumption, broke the roof. What does that mean? There were so many people who said Hallel together, it seemed as though the roofs were breaking due to all the commotion and noise. And this is a favorite part of mine, of the Seder, is the singing. And we're still going one more year with just my immediate family, myself and my husband and my kids. Our cousins and aunts and uncles and parents aren't going to be with us, but I think I'll try to get my family, the 5 of us, to sing as though the roofs are breaking due to all the commotion and the noise. And I'll end with just a sort of responding to unexpectedly to Jay's speaking about the Haggadah of the Jews of India. Also a little bit of Jewish ethnic diversity here. I've befriended recently a young man whose parents were from Iran, and he has gotten very, very closely connected to his Persian roots. And he just recently published an article in this new journal called Zaman, which is about it's written by Jews of Persian descent. And he got a hold of a Sidur that was written in the 16th or 17th century. It didn't stick around because it was in manuscript form. It was never brought to print. But this person who's a scholar he's working to cull through the manuscript of this Sidur to typeset it and bring it to print. And there was one line in particular that he shared with me from before the Shemona Esrei, which I thought was so interesting. This is what we say in our Sidur. Malchuto b'ratzon kiblu alayim Moshe v'nei Yisrael lecha anu shira b'simcha rabba v'amru kulam. This is right before Micha Mocha. Translating into English, His kingship they willingly accepted upon themselves. Moshe and the children of Israel answered with song, with great joy, and they all said. So this section of the Shemona Esrei, which we say every day, recalls the time that Moshe and Bnei Israel called out in song from the sea as they were crossing. We don't have reference in this text to the crossing of the sea, but in this Persian Siddur that he is excavating and bringing back to life and shared with me, I was so excited to read this pasuk. In the Persian Siddur, rather than this shortened version here, it says, Malchuto b'ratzon kiblu alei Moshe v'Aharon u'Miriam b'chol b'nei Yisrael k'sha'alu min hayam lecha anu shira b'gila b'rina b'simcha u'v'tzala rabba amru anu v'amru kulam. So the Bnei Israel, they accepted his kingship willingly upon themselves. Oops. And Moshe and Aharon and Miriam and all of the children of Israel who ascended from the sea answered with song, these 4 synonyms of joy, Gila, Rina, Ditza, Tzahala, and they all answered together. And I'm going to try to keep, I love this imagery from this Persian Siddur. I'm going to try to keep this in mind as we together say Hallel and think about the culmination, the end of this narrative arc of going from slavery, going from idol worshipers to physical exaltation and to spiritual exaltation as we reenact our crossing through the Red Sea. Thank you.
Shakach, thank you for sharing. Someone sent in a question, and they, like so many people, both last year and this year, are finding themselves having a Seder alone. And they asked what advice we would give, what advice we would give for a person who's finding themselves alone at the Seder. So I'm going to pose it to our panelists, but I'll just start with a few things that come to mind. One is that get two Haggadahs, because if you with different commentaries, because then you're really going to have if you read a Haggadah with a commentary, you're really in dialogue with that commentator, and you have a different person in some way you're conversing with each night at the Seder. The other thought that comes to mind is, I know when I talked about Seder plates, I was a little bit Ashkenazi-centric, focusing on the Ashkenazi minhagim around Seder plates. But really, if you're interested in what other communities do, whether it's the Persian community or the Taimani, the Yemenite community or the Moroccan community, there are really some incredible minhagim and customs that are very different from what you might have grown up with in an Ashkenazi community in terms of foods or the sort of reenacting physically elements of the Seder with putting matzah on your back or passing the Seder plate over your head, as different communities do. And those are things also that you can do this year when you're alone that might enhance your Seder and make it different from anything that you've had in the past. And the final thought, though, is that the Seder really is and the Haggadah is about this dichotomy between a sense of reenacting that experience of slavery and that experience of redemption. And the matzah, right, it's lechem only, it's the bread of the poor person, the bread of affliction, and also a symbol of our redemption. And it's okay, I think, when you're having a Seder and alone, that you're to feel lonely, and as much as you're also celebrating this incredible part of our tradition, and to hold both of those feelings within yourself at the same time is very much what the Seder and the Haggadah are trying to get us to do. I don't know if other panelists want to share their thoughts about that.
May I?
Absolutely.
So since you mentioned Morocco, since I've traveled the world with different communities, I don't know whether you know the hashkafa of Seder Sinai, but last year and this year, since the Seder falls out on Yom Tov, not on Shabbat, last year a panel of Orthodox rabbinic rabbis from Morocco issued that you could use Zoom actually. So I just want to throw that out, that the Moroccan, the Edom Mizrach rabbis, I know some took it back and all, but they did say that since it wasn't breaking Shabbat and it was an issue of Yom Tov, that it was permitted. I'm just throwing that out. You can argue with that if you want, but there was, as you know, there was that psak halakha last year in Israel. So
I think they backpedaled after they issued that. I think they got in trouble for it.
we got in trouble from the Ashkenazi rabbinate, but they backpedaled, but didn't really. But anyway, I'm just throwing that out. That's all.
I'll say something that I really enjoyed last year. My brother's family set it up. They made he and his kids made divrei Torah, so divrei Seder, and they sent us like a little packet before. So I was so sad that we weren't with them, but I got to read their, I saved them for different parts of the Seder to read them out loud. So felt a little bit like they were with us. So I don't know, I found that a really nice suggestion if you're far from family or friends that you wish you could be with, to kind of share words with each other.
Thank you.
Rabbi, don't excommunicate me from the show, please.
No, not we're lucky to have you, and I really appreciate your willingness to share all of your teachings, and that's true for all of you. Thank you so much, Joe, Amalia, Jay, and Alana for sharing. We're really fortunate as a community to have so many wonderful educators as part of our shul, and wonderful teachers. So we have a number of upcoming programs to help us prepare for Pesach. On Thursday night at 8 p.m., I'll be doing a Kashering for Pesach Q&A. Also, if you have, and answering any other Pesach-related halachic questions that you have. So please bring your questions then, and also if you ever need anything that's more pressing, feel free to call or email me at any time. Sunday night, there'll be the second annual Recipes with the Rebbitzin that Chaya will be doing at 8 p.m. And on Wednesday night next week, I'll be giving my Shabbat HaGadol Drasha entitled, Should We Make Whole What Is Broken? So that's a lot of upcoming programs, and I'm hoping to see, I look forward to seeing many of you over Yontif, God willing. Thank you again, everyone, for coming.
Excellent program.
For teaching.
Excellent program. Thank you.